Shelley Duvall's terror became one of horror's most replayed images. The Shining was sold as Kubrick's masterpiece of control, Nicholson's madness, Wendy's panic, and a film that made fear feel almost too real. But decades of interviews, set stories, and reassessments forced a harder question about the cost of that image. Duvall's performance did not just show fear, it showed a woman being asked to stay inside fear long enough for it to become cinema history. The film can remain great. Kubrick's genius can still be debated. But when an actress's exhaustion helps make a masterpiece immortal, who gets to define what we were watching? Art, pressure, or the reputation war between them? The Shining is often remembered through Kubrick's control and Nicholson's eruption. A hallway stretches like a trap. A red-patterned carpet pulls the eye forward. Snow seals the hotel from the world outside. Then the axe comes down, splitting the door and fixing the scene in popular memory. For many viewers, that is the film. Stanley Kubrick's cold design, Jack Nicholson's face through a broken doorway, and a line delivered so sharply it left the story and entered popular culture. That memory is not wrong. The Shining has survived because its images feel built to last. The Overlook Hotel does not behave like a normal location. It feels arranged so every corridor, color, and silence can press on the viewer. Kubrick's reputation sits inside that architecture. He is remembered as the filmmaker of control, the artist who would not soften the frame to make anyone comfortable. Nicholson receives a different kind of immortality. His performance is remembered as eruption, eyebrows lifted, voice bending, body turning breakdown into spectacle. Cinema history has often rewarded male collapse when it arrives loudly enough to become iconic. It is quotable. It is easy to replay. It takes up the room. Between those two legends, Shelley Duvall was often placed as the frightened reaction, not the architect, not the explosion, the alarm. But a horror film has no pulse unless someone inside it can feel the danger. Shelley Duvall is the warning signal inside The Shining. She is the body that tells the audience the hotel is not merely strange, but unsafe. Wendy Torrance does not control the maze. She does not command the room. She survives by registering threat before everyone else can name it. That role is easier to underestimate than it should be. Wendy is not written as the grand threat, the brilliant director figure, or the mythic madman with the axe. She is the person whose fear gives the danger a target. Without her, Jack's collapse risks becoming performance without consequence. Without her, the Overlook becomes a museum of dread instead of a place where a woman and a child might not escape. Duvall makes the danger physical. Her shoulders tighten, her breathing changes. Her eyes search for exits before the scene gives her one. She does not turn fear into glamour. She makes it awkward, exposed, repetitive, and human. That is why Wendy matters. She is not the weakest part of the film. She is the part that proves the threat has reached a living person. The hard part is that the culture often remembered the effect more clearly than the artist. Wendy's terror became iconic, but Duvall's craft was flattened into the face of panic. The very thing that made her performance work also trapped public memory around one expression. Wide eyes, raised weapon, trembling voice, a woman trying to stay alive inside a story already closing around her. Before that image swallowed so much, Shelley Duvall had built one of the strangest screen presences in American cinema. She was not a generic studio beauty, and that was part of her power. Her face had angles Hollywood did not know how to standardize. Her voice could sound fragile, funny, strange, stubborn, and fully present in the same scene. Robert Altman understood that quality. In his films, Duvall did not feel manufactured. She felt discovered in the moment, as if she had walked into the frame with a private logic no one else could imitate. In Nashville, in Three Women, and across her collaborations with Altman, she offered something rare, a performer who could seem delicate without disappearing, eccentric without becoming decorative, and uncertain without losing intelligence. That history matters because it corrects the lazy memory of her as only a woman screaming in a horror film. Duvall had range before Wendy Torrance. She had timing, oddness, wit, and an ability to make vulnerability feel unpredictable. She was not waiting for Kubrick to give her importance. She had already made herself difficult to categorize, but some roles become so large that they reduce the person who performed them. The Shining gave Duvall immortality, but not always fullness. The culture preserved her fear better than her variety. It remembered the woman backing away with a bat more easily than the actress, who had built a strange, confident body of work before the Overlook Hotel became the role many viewers used to define her. That is why this part of the story still cuts. The film's greatness is real. Kubrick's design remains powerful. Nicholson's madness remains unforgettable. But Shelley Duvall's contribution was not background noise inside someone else's masterpiece. She was the living system that made the terror register. And that leaves the question reputation wars cannot avoid. When a woman's fear helps make a masterpiece work, who receives the glow of genius? And who absorbs the cost of being remembered mostly as fear? To answer that, we have to step into the power map where control and exposure were never evenly shared. On a Kubrick set, control was part of the legend. That word, control, followed Stanley Kubrick like a second credit. It was attached to the way he framed a room, held a silence, shaped a performance, and made space feel hostile without raising its voice. In The Shining, that control became almost architectural. The hotel did not simply contain the story, it seemed built around his command. Behind the camera, control could look calm. A monitor glowed in the dark. A director watched, measured, adjusted, waited. The public image around Kubrick turned that patience into mythology. The uncompromising auteur, the filmmaker who would not accept anything false, the artist who believed the frame had to submit to his vision, that position carries a specific kind of power. It is not only the power to say cut, it is the power to decide what fear should look like, how long it should last, and when it is not yet convincing enough. In cinema history, that power is often praised as discipline. From the actor's side, it can feel very different. Shelley Duvall stood on the other side of that authority. She was not protected by the distance of the monitor. She was not remembered as the architect of the maze. Her work happened in the exposed place, under light, in costume, inside the emotional weather the film required. Wendy Torrance had to remain frightened for the movie to keep breathing. That meant Duvall had to make fear visible, not once as an isolated moment, but as the emotional condition of the character. This was not a neutral arrangement. One side controlled the frame, the rhythm, and the threshold for what counted as truthful. The other side had to offer the body that made truth visible. This is where the power map becomes clear. Kubrick controlled the design of fear. Duvall had to carry its evidence on her body. One person shaped the pressure from behind the camera. The other had to appear inside it, with no safe corner where the audience could not see her. That does not make Duvall passive. It makes her job more difficult. A weak performance could have made Wendy seem foolish. A shallow performance could have turned her panic into noise. But Duvall gave the character something raw, a human response to danger that did not look neat or heroic. Her fear had texture. It was awkward, physical, strained, and alive. The problem is that cinema often knows how to praise control more easily than exposure. A director's control becomes method. An actor's exposure becomes content. Kubrick could be described through vision, precision, and authorship. Duvall was too often remembered through trembling, crying, and collapse. That imbalance is the heart of this chapter. To understand Shelley Duvall's wound, you have to understand the architecture of her workplace. The Shining is about a woman trapped inside a hotel with a man becoming dangerous. But the production image around the film created its own parallel tension. A performer asked to remain emotionally open inside a system built around another person's command. The set was not the Overlook Hotel. Fiction and workplace are not the same thing. But the symbolic overlap is hard to ignore. The character had no easy escape from the hotel. The actress had no simple escape from the demands of the film while the work was still unfolding. That is what makes this story more complicated than a simple villain and victim version. Kubrick's control produced images that hold power. Duvall's exposure helped make those images human. The film needed both, but history did not reward both in the same language. One became the genius who controlled the nightmare. The other became the face that proved the nightmare was real. And when history speaks that way for decades, it teaches audiences whose labor is considered authorship and whose labor is treated as raw material. A director can stand in the shadows and be called visionary. An actress can stand in the light and be remembered as the evidence of someone else's vision. That is why the question cannot stop at whether The Shining is great. It is great. The harder question is how greatness gets distributed. Who gets the myth? Who gets the wound? Who is named as the mind behind the terror? And who is left carrying the image of terror in their face? Duvall was not only playing a woman trapped in a hotel, she was working inside a filmmaking structure where control and exposure were not evenly shared. And inside that demand for perfection, human limits would soon begin to show under the pressure of repetition. A scene can look perfect on screen, but the next question is harder. How many private resets does that perfection require before the camera finally believes it? The first crack was not a headline. It was a body being asked to return to panic again and again. The problem was not simply repetition. Repetition is part of filmmaking. A line is adjusted. A camera move is cleaned. A gesture is tried until it fits the frame. But repetition changes meaning when the material is fear. It is one thing to repeat a walk across a room. It is another to repeat collapse. Shelley Duvall spent 13 months in England making The Shining. That length matters because Wendy Torrance is not a character who drifts calmly through the story. She is written into pressure, almost from the moment the hotel closes around her. The work required crying, retreating, pleading, defending, searching, and holding terror long enough for the camera to believe it. A clapperboard falls once, then again, then again. The sound is ordinary on a set, but for an actor living inside panic, every fresh start can feel like the body being ordered back into danger. Cry again, shake again, run again, protect the child again, face the man again. For the audience, those moments become cinema. For Duvall, they were work repeated through nerves, breath, throat, face, and muscle. The staircase scene became the image people return to when they talk about this cost. Wendy backs away with a baseball bat, her voice breaking as Jack moves toward her. The emotional demand is not simple. She has to look terrified, but not theatrical, weak, but still fighting, cornered, but still trying to think. Accounts around the film have long focused on the punishing number of takes for that scene. The number often repeated is 127. Because production memories can turn into legend, the exact number should be handled carefully. But the emotional fact does not depend on worshiping the number. What matters is what the scene required: sustained panic, held over and over until fear stopped being a single performance and became a condition the body had to keep entering. That is why the scene remains uncomfortable. Duvall is not simply screaming. She is trying to keep Wendy alive inside a space where every step backward seems smaller than the threat coming forward. Her hands hold the bat as if it is both weapon and proof that she has nothing else. Her face does not offer glamorous terror. It offers exhaustion, embarrassment, dread in the effort of staying upright. This is where the body begins to argue with the role. Crying on command is a skill. Crying all day is a strain. Panic can be performed, but it also leaves traces. The breath tightens, the throat dries, the eyes swell, the muscles remember tension after the camera stops. When people say Duvall looked genuinely afraid, that is part of why the performance worked. But it is also the part that asks a harder question. How often can a performer re-enter fear before the body stops treating it as pretending? Roger Ebert recorded Duvall describing the experience as almost unbearable. That phrase matters because it does not sound like publicity language. It does not make the process romantic. It points to a limit. A performer describing work that pushed close to what she could carry. She also spoke about the experience in complicated terms elsewhere, and that complexity should not be erased. But complexity does not cancel the weight of the phrase. Almost unbearable means the work came near a boundary. It means the finished image was not created in comfort. It means the terror audiences consumed had passed through a human system first. The audience saw the final version. It saw the chosen cut, the moment that survived the edit. Duvall lived through the versions that did not survive. The broken attempts, the reset breath, the climb back to the starting line, the space between takes when the body had to calm down only to be sent back. Cinema history often hides that part. It remembers the perfect image, not the cost of reaching it. It remembers the director getting the scene, not the performer spending herself so the scene could exist. The Shining turned fear into design, but Shelley Duvall had to make that design breathe. She had to place a nervous system inside Kubrick's architecture of dread and keep making it visible until the frame had what it needed. By the time the camera captured the fear history preserved, the process had already done its work. The director had the image he wanted. The film had the terror it needed, but behind that scene was a question the movie could not answer. How much human depletion can art absorb before it starts calling the cost greatness? That question leads to the next machine, the one that can turn exhaustion into proof of genius. The genius director myth does not always deny pain. Sometimes it absorbs pain and rebrands it as proof of greatness. After a difficult shoot, the cleanest version of the story is the one told from the finished film outward. The audience sees the frame. Critics see the design. Film history sees the discipline. What disappears is the human cost between the first take and the image that survives. That is how the machine protects itself. It does not have to say exhaustion did not happen. It only has to rename it. Pressure becomes discipline. Strain becomes commitment. A performer pushed to the edge becomes evidence that the director knew how to reach something real. The harder the process sounds, the more the myth can present it as seriousness. Kubrick fit neatly inside that language. He was not sold as a casual filmmaker. He was sold as a man of precision, a director who controlled the room until the room surrendered. The praise around that image made discomfort sound necessary. If a scene looked perfect, then the method behind it was treated as part of the achievement. But that praise has a blind spot. It sees the director's demand more clearly than the actor's depletion. It can admire the hand shaping the image while overlooking the body being shaped inside it. The Shining became easier to defend because the result was so strong. The corridors worked, the silence worked, Jack's madness worked, Wendy's fear worked. Viewers sat in dark theaters and felt the pressure tighten until the hotel seemed to breathe. When a film works that well, audiences often forgive the process before they understand it. They do not mean to be cold. They love the finished thing. They love the clean terror, the controlled images, the feeling of being trapped without being unsafe. The theater gives them fear without consequence. That comfort matters. The viewer can leave when the credits end. The actor had to make the fear credible before the credits existed. Auteur worship has a convenient language. It tells us the pressure was worth it because the image lasts. It tells us the pain was part of the craft because the film became important. It tells us greatness sometimes requires sacrifice, without always asking who was selected to do the sacrificing. That is where Shelley Duvall's performance becomes more than a role. It becomes a receipt the system did not want to read. Her fear helped the movie function. Her exposed face gave the hotel a witness, a target, and a nervous system. Yet the language of greatness gave glory to the director's control. History could say Kubrick got the performance. That phrase sounds professional. It sounds clean, but it hides the exchange. What did Duvall have to spend so the film could get it? This is not an argument against ambition. Great cinema requires difficulty. Actors repeat scenes. Directors push for detail. Sets become exhausting. But pressure is not automatically noble. Difficulty is not automatically moral. A demanding process does not become justified simply because the final image is admired. That distinction is where the genius machine becomes dangerous. It turns outcome into permission. If the work is great, the method becomes harder to question. If the scene is unforgettable, the discomfort becomes legend. If the director's name is protected by genius, the performer's pain can be treated as raw material for someone else's vision. A production ledger can count equipment, location, salaries, delays, and shooting days. It cannot easily count the cost of a nervous system pushed toward panic for realism. It does not have a neat line for depletion. It does not record when craft begins to feel too close to survival. The industry has always been better at pricing time than pricing damage. It can tell us how long a film took to shoot. It can tell us how expensive a set was. It can tell us who directed the masterpiece, but it rarely tells us what a performer had to leave inside a scene that looked perfect. So the question is not whether The Shining deserved its place in film history. It did. The question is whether film history has been too willing to let greatness close the case. Because once the image becomes iconic, the process begins to disappear. Once the director becomes legend, the actor's exhaustion becomes background. And once pain is called dedication, the audience may forget to ask who paid the bill. It would take years for the fog around that mythology to thin. A later generation would return to the same footage with less patience for old excuses and a different question in mind. Not whether the film was powerful, but whether power had been allowed to explain away too much. History does not only preserve mistakes. Sometimes it laughs first, then takes decades to understand what it mocked. That is part of what happened to Shelley Duvall. Before the modern reassessment, before viewers return to the footage with different questions, her performance in The Shining had already been punished by a cold joke disguised as an award category. In 1981, she was nominated for Worst Actress at the Golden Raspberry Awards. The label was simple, too simple. It looked at Wendy Torrance shaking, crying, screaming, backing away, trying to survive, and treated the performance as failure. It did not ask what kind of role she had been asked to carry. It did not ask how long she had been asked to hold panic inside her body. It did not ask why her fear looked exposed. The culture saw the noise before it understood the labor. It saw the panic before it understood the pressure. And for years, the easiest version of the joke survived. Shelley Duvall was too much, too strained, too frantic. But time can turn a joke into evidence. Decades later, audiences were no longer watching The Shining with the same innocence. They had seen behind-the-scenes footage. They had read interviews. They had become more skeptical of the old language that called every difficult process genius and every exhausted performer dedicated. Scenes that once made viewers dismiss Duvall began to look different. The staircase no longer looked only like a frightened woman overacting. It looked like a performer asked to sustain fear past the point where ordinary acting becomes physically costly. Her wide eyes, broken voice, and shaking body no longer seemed like weakness. They began to look like the reason the horror worked. Then, in 2022, the Razzie organization withdrew Duvall's Worst Actress nomination. The reversal came more than 40 years after the original nomination. It did not change the film. It did not change the performance, it changed the frame. That matters because public judgment is rarely neutral. A nomination can become a stain. A joke can become a shortcut. For decades, the old label helped flatten Duvall into a caricature, the screaming woman, the frantic actress, the weak point in a masterpiece. The withdrawal did not repair everything, but it admitted something important. The culture had laughed too quickly at a performance it had not understood. The same performance once treated as bad acting later became evidence that the audience had misread her. History did not change the scene. It changed its conscience. But the reassessment did not remain locked inside old award records. It grew larger because the public had changed. Viewers were asking questions earlier. Film culture pushed aside. What does a performance cost when it requires panic again and again? When does a director's demand stop sounding like perfectionism and start sounding like a system that needed one body to absorb too much pressure? Who gets protected by the word masterpiece? Those questions became harder to avoid in the summer of 2024, when Shelley Duvall's passing brought her name back into public memory. She passed away in Texas at 75 after complications from diabetes, according to public reports from her longtime partner. The news was quiet, but the reaction was not simple. People did not only remember The Shining, they remembered the way they had remembered her. They remembered the clips, the jokes, the interviews, the fascination with her face, her voice, and her fragility. They remembered how easily a living actress had been reduced to a horror image. That is one of the coldest things fame can do. It can turn a person into a frame. It can make one expression more famous than the life behind it. While Duvall was alive, people knew how to replay her fear. After she was gone, more people began asking whether they had ever looked past it. Her passing did not create the question. It made the question harder to escape. For decades, audiences could separate the movie from the woman and enjoy the terror. After 2024, that separation felt less comfortable. The old image was still there. Wendy in the Overlook, cornered, shaking, trying to survive. But now another image pressed against it. Shelley Duvall as an artist whose work had been judged, mocked, and reconsidered too late. The late public trial did not produce an easy villain. What it exposed was a pattern. Film culture had celebrated the fear, misread the performer, and waited too long to correct the record. And once that record reopened, the next question became more difficult. If history had been wrong about the performance, what else had it been too willing to excuse? The internet prefers stories with clean borders. It wants a villain figure on one side, a harmed person on the other. But Shelley Duvall's story does not obey that shape. As modern viewers returned to The Shining, two arguments formed almost immediately. One side saw Stanley Kubrick as the director who pushed Duvall too far, turning a woman's distress into a legendary image. The other side pushed back, arguing that Duvall was a professional actor, not a helpless object, and that demanding work is not automatically exploitation. Both versions contain a piece of the truth. Both also flatten the person at the center of the story. If Kubrick becomes only a villain figure, the film becomes too easy to condemn. If Duvall becomes only a professional who chose the work, the cost becomes too easy to dismiss. The harder question sits between those two positions. Can an actor have agency and still be harmed by the conditions around her? Can a director be a major artist and still represent a system that asks too much? The public trial did not fail because people cared. It failed whenever it tried to make Shelley Duvall smaller than her own complicated memory. That complication matters because Duvall did not leave behind a simple revenge story. In a later interview with The Hollywood Reporter, she described Kubrick in terms that disrupt the easiest online verdict. She said he was very warm and friendly to her. That sentence does not erase the difficulty of the shoot, but it does force the story to become more human. Duvall could speak about pressure without turning her memory into a courtroom script. She could acknowledge strain, repetition, and emotional demand while still recognizing the value of the finished film. That is not contradiction. That is how real memory often works. For an actor, a difficult role can become both wound and achievement. The same scene that drains the body can also become proof of skill. The same director who demands too much can also draw out work the performer knows will last. Duvall's comments remind us that she was not simply carried through the production like a prop. She understood her craft. She knew the camera. She knew what the role required. That does not make the conditions harmless. It only means the damage cannot be explained by taking her intelligence away. She was capable of naming the difficulty and still refusing to reduce herself to damage. That is why the public argument remains uncomfortable. The truth does not sit neatly. It sits inside the uneasy space where a gifted performer can be proud of work that also cost her something. The lazy version of the story turns Kubrick into a cartoon villain and Duvall into a helpless figure. It gives the audience emotional clarity, but it takes something from her. It takes away the seriousness of her labor. It treats her tears as something only done to her, instead of also recognizing them as something she performed, shaped, endured, and delivered. That distinction is not small. Shelley Duvall was not memorable because she was broken in front of a camera. She was memorable because she had the skill to make fear feel physically true. She could let a scene look awkward, ugly, exposed, and uncontrolled without losing the emotional line inside it. Wendy Torrance works because Duvall never tries to make fear elegant. She lets it look human. To call her only a victim is to repeat another form of erasure. It replaces the old joke about her performance with a new pity that still refuses to see the artist. She was not simply crushed by the film. She survived the process and left behind a performance that later viewers had to reconsider. But survival is not the same as innocence. Professionalism does not cancel exhaustion. Agency does not erase pressure. The fact that Duvall could speak warmly of Kubrick does not mean the system around his authority should escape examination. A person can refuse bitterness and still have been asked to carry too much. That is where the real verdict begins to sharpen. The question is not whether Shelley Duvall hated Stanley Kubrick. The question is not whether The Shining should be thrown away. The question is whether film culture has been too comfortable confusing endurance with consent and pain with artistic necessity. Duvall's dignity lies in the fact that she cannot be reduced to one side of the debate. She was the performer, not the evidence. She was the artist, not merely the cost. And even if she did not frame herself as powerless, the ledger of cinema history still has to count what was spent. It is time to open that ledger and ask who paid the highest price. The cruelest part of Shelley Duvall's legacy is not that people forgot her. It is that many remembered only the version of her that was terrified. Before that face became fixed in horror history, Duvall had already built a screen life that did not fit the usual Hollywood mold. She could be strange, funny, fragile, sharp, playful, and completely unpredictable. In Popeye, Annie Hall, and the films she made with Robert Altman, she was not just a woman running from danger. She was a performer with an odd rhythm an unmistakable face, and a presence that refused to behave like anyone else's. But The Shining narrowed the frame. One image became louder than the rest. Wendy Torrance, with her eyes wide, her voice breaking, her body pulled into fear. A performance that helped make her immortal also trapped her in one emotional state. The room history kept returning to was not the full career. It was the panic. That is the first line in the damage ledger. Shelley Duvall did not lose talent. She lost proportion. The public memory made one role so large that it cast a shadow over everything around it. The woman became the scream, and the scream became easier to replay than the person behind it. From there, the debt moves to Stanley Kubrick and to the system that protected the myth around him. Kubrick did not lose his place in cinema history. The Shining still stands. His control, his images, his precision, and his influence remain part of how film is taught, praised, and argued over. But the statue is no longer smooth. A question now sits beside the achievement. When a director is praised for controlling everything, where does his responsibility begin toward the person standing in front of the camera? If the actor's distress becomes part of the image, does the director own only the art or also the conditions that help produce it? That question does not erase the film. It makes the admiration less innocent. For years, Hollywood had an easy language for this kind of story. A demanding director was called uncompromising. A worn-down actor was called dedicated. A painful process was folded into the legend after the masterpiece arrived. But that language no longer works the same way. The praise around the director's chair now carries a harder question. Not because audiences suddenly stopped recognizing craft, but because they began asking who was asked to absorb the pressure that craft required. The price of a perfect image could no longer be hidden inside words like discipline, vision, or genius. Hollywood lost something too. It lost the ability to sell artistic sacrifice as a clean bargain. The old defense was simple. The film was great, so the cost must have been worth it. But modern viewers are less willing to accept that equation without asking who got to decide the value of the trade. A masterpiece can still be a masterpiece and still leave behind an ethical debt. That debt lands finally on the audience. Viewers lost the right to watch Wendy's fear as something completely safe. For decades, the staircase, the hotel corridors, and the trapped look on Duvall's face could be consumed as pure horror. The viewer could sit at a distance, protected by the screen, and treat panic as craft. The terror belonged to Wendy. The cost, if there was one, stayed outside the frame. Now the image asks for more. Each time Duvall's face fills the screen, the question is no longer only whether Wendy will survive. Another question presses forward. What did Shelley Duvall have to give so this fear could feel so real? That does not mean the audience must stop watching. It means watching is no longer simple. The performance still works. The film still holds power. But the clean separation between fiction and labor has been damaged. The scream is still part of the story, but now it also points back toward the woman who had to shape it, sustain it, and carry its afterlife. This is the final loss in the ledger, innocence. Not the innocence of the film, because The Shining was never innocent. The loss belongs to the viewer who once believed a great scene arrived fully formed, untouched by the body that made it possible. When fear on screen spills beyond the script, it becomes something cinema cannot easily swallow. it becomes a bitter legacy, one that forces us to redefine the border between performance and survival. And once that border starts to move, the question becomes larger than one film, one director, or one frightened character. It becomes a question about cinema itself. When an image feels unforgettable because a human being had to endure it, who carries the memory of that endurance after the applause fades quietly? Duvall's performance was not weak. It was physically exposed, emotionally open, and harder to watch once the cost behind it becomes visible. The Shining remains a masterpiece. That truth does not need to be denied for another truth to stand beside it. The fear on screen still works because it feels human, not decorated. It moves through her breathing, her eyes, her voice, and the way her body seems to brace before the next wave of terror arrives. But once the film slows down in memory, the question changes. We are no longer only watching Wendy Torrance survive the overlook. We are watching Shelley Duvall turn exhaustion, repetition, and pressure into a performance people could not forget. That is the difficult legacy. That frightened image became iconic, but it nearly swallowed the woman who made it possible. Cinema called it horror. History called it genius. The audience called it unforgettable. But a great film cannot wash away the cost of the person inside the frame. When fear looks that real, we have to ask where the realness came from and who was left carrying it after the credits ended. Hollywood calls it a performance. Film history calls it a masterpiece. But Shelley Duvall's face leaves a harder question behind. When the elevator door slams shut and that frightened face disappears into the silence of the overlook, what are we really admiring? Acting or endurance? Art or survival? The Shining remains unforgettable, but its fear no longer feels clean. If this story made you rethink what a masterpiece can cost like this video, subscribe to Reputation Wars and share your thoughts below. Because sometimes the final image is not the ending. It is the question the film leaves behind.